Okay, good evening, students. Today, after a long time, back on Neuro E-Pathshala, I propose to deal with electrodiagnostics for a couple of lectures, and this is an introductory lecture to that extent. So let's see how we progress on this. So let's basic science concepts are required to learn electrophysiology and long forgotten membrane physiology, how physiological discharges are generated by the cell membrane, the volume conduction theory, how electrical discharges spread and propagate in any conducting medium as governed by the laws of physics, neuromuscular physiology, the structures and functions of the motor unit, sensory nerve and associated connective tissue, the body's response to injury, this morphological and electrical timing and changes associated with different types of injury, whether demyelination and axonal damage, and anatomic innervations, the dermatomes, myotomes at the level of the root, plexus, and peripheral nerves. And these are very, very important for us to understand. And in coming classes, we're dealing separately with the brachial plexus and lumbosacral plexus and radiculopathies separately. So this is an introductory class. So the human body is constantly generating electrical energy that we all know. The muscle and nerve cells are constantly using electric discharges to communicate among different parts of the body. These electric discharges can be recorded, displayed, measured, and interpreted by using specialized equipment. The architecture is disturbed, normal processes are disturbed on the face of injury to either, and these are captured on the electrodiagnostic testing. The electrodiagnostic medicine is the process of observing and interpreting neuromuscular electric discharges for clinical purposes. Though, most importantly, for all the electrodiagnostic medicine, history is very important. It is required to establish a broad differential diagnosis. Identify where is the problem in your axis. Is it a plexopathy, radiculopathy, nerve problem? And also you should do physical examination, should confirm the hypothesis from the history, and then direct the electrodiagnosis. So the mere referral to your lab for EMG is not enough. You have to study the case and you have to go through the history of the case, and then you also have to examine the case before you plan to do any electrodiagnostics. So electrodiagnostic studies basically are nerve conduction studies and EMG. These are the important things that DNB neurology and DM students start learning as soon as they join. We stimulate the nerves by delivering an electrical current via a stimulator wand. What happens is the axon of the stimulated nerve generates action potentials that propagate both proximally and distally from the site of stimulation. The electrodes placed over the nerve or a relevant muscle pick up the action potential as it propagates onto them. The signal is picked up by the electrodes, and the signal which is picked by the electrodes is amplified, filtered, and processed by the equipment. This is the basic what we are measuring in nerve conduction studies, the compound muscle action potential, what we call CMAP, and what we measure in needle EMG is motor unit action potential, what we call as MAP. So in neuroconduction study, the signal is converted to a waveform, evoked responses. This is the evoked response that is displayed on the screen. In this, the x-axis is represents time in millisecond, or y-axis represents voltage in micro or millivolts. So in this way, this connotation is very, very important, and you will be remembering this. Recording electrodes are placed on sensory nerves to record sensory nerve conduction studies. Proximal stimulation of sensory nerve results in sensory nerve action potential on the screen. It is the electrical signal summation of the discharges by the sensory neurons depolarizing the membranes of what's called axolemma. So you do a sensory nerve action potential and you do a motor nerve action potentials. The motor nerve conduction studies consist of recording the compound muscle action potential, and that is recorded by placing the electrodes for a muscle belly and stimulating the corresponding nerve proximally, and that produces a CMAP, which is the summation of the electrical signals discharged by the muscle fibers. And when depolarization occurs in the membranes, and that is sacrolemma. There are some late responses which you have to study. These are H reflex, F wave, and A wave. Evaluation of the proximal portions of the peripheral nerve is achieved. More time is required for the distal stimulus to trigger the F wave. When you read about F wave, and then when I show you the diagram, you'll understand it better. The other evoked responses, what we study by stimulating electrodes which are placed at the periphery and recording electrodes which are placed proximally over the scalp and other areas include brainstem auditory evoked responses. Auditory evoked potentials are recorded from the scalp, but they originate from the brainstem level. Visual evoked potentials, VEPs, somatosensory evoked potentials, and motor evoked potentials. These are very other aspects and of evoked potentials what we have to learn in the course of our DNB and DM studies. So if you look at the features of evoked response as a CMAP, the left ulnar and this has been stimulated. You can see the onset, that is O, the peak, that is P, and the trough, that is T here, and base to peak amplitude is A, that is and the duration is D from O to the T. So, and you can see the 2 minutes per division is milliseconds and 50 microvolts per division. This is the division which you see here. This is the division, and this division has uh, 2 milliseconds, and the this one is called 50 microvolts, and so you can see on the paper these things. Okay. What are the features of CMAP, and what we have to do is first study is so if you picturize in your mind, this is a compound muscle action potential should have distal latency, compound muscle action potential, amplitude, duration, the nerve conduction velocity, and the F wave. These are all the things which are associated in the motor nerve conduction studies. So the distal latency, it is the time between the stimulus and the response. In motor nerve conduction studies, latency includes the nerve conduction time and also the neuromuscular transmission time. The time from the stimulation to the initial deflection from the baseline is the onset latency. Peak latency, time from the stimulation to upward peak. So, but what we are interested in only this. This is the onset latency. There is our distal latency. The amplitude is dependent on the number of axons that conduct impulses from the stimulus point to the muscle, the number of functioning motor end plates, and the muscle volume. So all these things factor into the amplitude of the CMAP. It is measured from the baseline to the upward peak, that is base to peak, or from the upward to downward peak to peak, or from the upward to downward peak. So these are the various measures in which the amplitude is measured. And as you said, this is the 50 microvolts per division, and 2 milliseconds is the on x-axis. The duration reflects the synchrony of individual muscle fiber discharges. If there is a significant difference in conduction velocity among nerve fibers, the duration will be prolonged. This is mainly related to the range of conduction velocities of the large myelinated fibers. Duration is measured from the onset of the first negative, this connotation is negative, to the positive baseline crossing. This is the crossing of positive baseline crossing. And duration from onset to peak latency is the rise time. So duration is important because it's related to the range of conduction velocity of the large myelinated fibers. The area. Area is the integrated area between the CMAP and the baseline. The area represents a combination of amplitude and duration. It therefore reflects a combination of the amplitude and reflects the number and synchrony of the muscle fibers activated. And this area is synchronous, the muscle fibers activated. The prolongation of the duration can cause a decrease in amplitude and may be misinterpreted as a conduction problem. In this situation, there may not be a significant difference in the area. So the abnormalities can be duration, prolongation of the duration. And this is one part of our electrophysiology studies. The other part is electromyography. A needle electrode is inserted through the skin and fascia to penetrate into the muscle and irritate its membrane called sarcolemma. The irritation elicits discharges from the sarcolemma that are picked up by the needle electrode and displayed as waveforms. Voluntary and spontaneous electrical discharge by the sarcolemma can be detected by the needle electrode and observed on the screen. As soon as you put the needle into the muscle, there will be insertional activity, and this activity subsides once the needle enters the muscle. So that is a burst of electrical discharge directly correlated to the irritation by the needle electrode. This insertional activity is to be observed for the first time when you do the needle. You push the needle into muscle. You push it in 4 different directions. One push, see the insertion activity, change the direction and push in another direction and see the insertional activity. The third direction and see the insertional activity should subside immediately. If it is persisting, that is abnormal and seen in polymyositis and various myositis. There are some normal and abnormal spontaneous discharges, which we call as end plate spikes, positive sharp waves, fibrillation potentials, fasciculation potentials, complex repetitive discharges, and myotonic discharges, myokimic discharges. These are all various abnormal spontaneous discharges which we see. As after putting the needle and observing the insertional activity, you ask the individual to rest. Don't allow him to do any activity, and he has to be totally relaxed to elicit the spontaneous discharges. Otherwise, what you get is MUAPs only, and that is not correct. So you have to wait for total relaxation of the muscle before you pick up these. Then comes the voluntary attributes, that the motor action, unit action potentials, morphology, slight activation, somewhat more activation, and units recruitment. These are studied in the voluntary. We'll come back to it later. So let's look at the instrumentation of the electromyography. What are things we usually see there? The equipment. Understanding how the instrumentation processes and displays biological signals will help to avoid misinterpreting erroneously derived data from the instrumentation errors. The signal path, the nature of the components will be discussed slowly. What are electrodes? These are a small piece of metal that is placed on our surface or in the part of the body being studied, that's the needle EMG. All nearby potentials may affect the electrode. So the potentials not only include those generated by nearby muscles and nerves, but also all other electrical resources such as room lights, electrical machinery, radios, pacemakers, and so on. Very difficult to do studies in ICU. Summation, that's called signal. The electrode makes contact with the body and conduct the sum of nearby potentials to the next link in the chain. A second electrode is placed nearby. So in essence, there are 2 electrodes. One is an active electrode and a reference electrode. Both the electrodes participate in the process of generation of the signal. The signals are very small in magnitude and difficult to measure and interpret. So what has to be done? They are to be transmitted from these 2 electrodes via cables into amplifiers. The amplifiers enlarge signals, and these signals are surrounded by an environment filled with a lot of electrical noise. So a differential amplifier and electronic filters, they remove unwanted extraneous noise while the required neurophysiological signal gets amplified. So this is the logic which we see, what we see on the graph. You can see the electrodes amplify one, amplify differential amplifiers, and you can slowly see the filters here, the amplifiers here, the filters here, and you can see the audio signal, the microprocessor, video monitor. We'll discuss these things. The amplified and filtered signal is simultaneously sent to two different components. One is a speaker, another visual display. What happens in speaker is that electrical strategy energy is converted into sound energy, so the signal can be heard. In visual display, the signal is visually represented as a waveform, analog or digital type. See the objective electrodiagnostic testing, which you can see in the machine, which we use for nerve conduction studies and needle electromyography. We can study femoral neuropathy, upper lumbar plexopathy, and in this class we'll discuss about brachial plexopathies and radiculopathies and how we differentiate. And next class we'll deal with the lower limbs. So in essence, we do a sensory nerve conduction studies, motor nerve conduction studies, needle EMG. So all the three components will constitute the electrophysiological studies. And you can see the electrodes, the two electrodes which I was talking, they are applied here. One electrode, second electrode, and you can stimulate here. And this is the action potential, that is a compound module action potential that is generated, which is coming from the, so this enters like this and comes out like this. And so the dorsal root ganglion. So this is sensory nerve action potential which you are seeing on the posterior aspect. It is very important to understand the concept of dorsal root ganglion in generation of the SNAP, because radiculopathies, they don't involve the dorsal root ganglion, so SNAPs are very well preserved. If SNAPs are affected in nerve conduction studies, it means that it is a post-ganglionic lesion. This is a pre-ganglionic and this is a post-ganglionic lesion. It's very important to understand that. So the sensory nerve action potential requires three structures to function properly. One is a myelin sheath, where saltatory conduction will take the sensory information very fast to the brain. The vasa nervorum that should supply, and the axon. So all the three things matter for generation of sensory nerve action potentials. The CMAP requires the following structures for proper functioning: that is myelin sheath, the axon, the vasa nervorum, motor nerve end plates, the neuromuscular junction, the muscle. So see, all these things contribute to the formation of the compound module action potential, which we do nerve conduction studies. To identify that, you can see that the stimulus is applied and it goes to the axon and comes back and generates a F wave here like this. This is the F wave. The F latency is prolonged in cases of demyelinating neuropathies. So when you stimulate the peripheral nerve, it goes to the anteriorly and it goes to the anti-horn cell and comes back via same nerve to generate the F wave. And the H reflex is similarly, and you can see the antidromic motor activation. You are applying the stimulus here, it goes to the anti-horn cell. Also, the sensory nerve activation also goes there, and some things orthotromic motor conduction takes place. And this is a soleus muscle which is supplied by the, this is 1B, that is a sensory afferent, and the gamma motor neurons that are the efferents are coming from. So what you get is a stimulus artifact first, the M wave, the H reflex. So this will we'll study in detail in subsequent lectures. The only sensitization what we're going to do in future classes. So needle EMG, as I was saying, muscle at rest, muscle with voluntary contraction. We have to do both things. So mononeuropathy, what happens if it is only one nerve that is abnormal snaps, one nerve territory only, means the sensory nerve action potential is absent because it is a postganglionic lesion. EMG abnormalities are restricted to one nerve only. That means if posterior tibial nerve is involved, then you can see in tibialis posterior. Abnormal late responses are limited to one nerve only. That is the most of the responses like H reflex and all. The paraspinal EMG is normal because the root is preserved here, and this is a mononeuropathy features. How what we're going to do in EMG to identify what are we dealing with? Is it a mononeuropathy, plexopathy, or radiculopathy? So in plexopathy, the snaps are abnormal because it's a postganglionic lesion. Variable abnormal late responses you get, and paraspinal EMG is normal. And these are three important points which we'll study more and more in due course in the coming classes. In radiculopathy, the snaps are normal because the preganglionic lesion, and paraspinal EMG is abnormal and difficult to localize to one root only, but we try and do the paraspinal EMG whenever you suspect radiculopathy. So now we have learned three things now: mononeuropathy, plexopathy, and radiculopathy. So now you see the radiculopathy problem, and this is the radiculopathy. This is the dorsal root ganglion, and from the sensory input is coming into the dorsal horn, and the motor output is going to the anterior horn cell and the motor neuron. The plexus is formed is by the each motor or each spinal nerve after it leaves the spinal cord divides into anterior primary rami and posterior primary ramus. The posterior primary ramus supplies the paraspinal muscles, and the anterior primary rami they join to form the brachial plexus and lumbosacral plexus. This point all should remember that why we do paraspinal EMG. You can see the sensory nerve action potential is preserved in cases of radiculopathy, and there may be a drop in motor unit action potentials, MUAPs, CMAPs in radiculopathy. There may be a drop, means this is gone, so you will have no MUAP here, and CMAPs remain normal or it may be diminished as some muscle receives tweaks from the other neurons. So I'll show you on the EMG how the motor units are dispersed in typical muscle fibers. The plexopathy, as I said, the sensory neuron usually gets lost here, and the motor muscle all will be preserved. CMAP will be preserved. The plexopathy, you can see this is the problem is that it's plexopathy distal to dorsal root ganglion. So the sensory neuron is diminished in amplitude or it may be absent. The anterior horn cell is a different thing. Again, what happens in anterior horn cell is the CMAP will be reduced, but the snaps are very well preserved. The main important thing is we have to identify this by doing EMG only. When you see spontaneous activities, circulation potentials, positive sharp waves, and fibrillation potentials, along with joint action potentials, and that's what is anterior horn cell disorder. So how will we differentiate? All from the dorsal root ganglia, this is the root versus plexus. Root lesions, all motor fibers distal to anterior horn cell are affected. So what happens? The paraspinal muscles, there will be abnormality. Truncal and proximal muscles, limb muscles, they all have show abnormals. Dorsal root ganglion and distal sensory nerves are intact. The stimulation of the sensory nerve results in normal snap in cases of narrow root lesions or radiculopathies. That's a important thing which if you can grasp. It's basically for the students who just entered DNB DM neurology, they are exposed to EMG machines and they are doing electrophysiology. The SNAP and CMAP findings and plexus lesions, nerve lesions, root lesions. There are three things which you will encounter. So nerve lesions, as I said earlier, abnormal snaps in one nerve territory only. Muscles affected in one nerve territory only in nerve lesions. Plexus, because it's a post-ganglionic, abnormal snaps, and paraspinal muscles are not affected. In root lesions, no effect on the snap because pathology is proximal to DRG, dorsal root ganglion, that is preganglionic. Denervation of the paraspinal muscles is possible here. You may see spontaneous activity like positive short wave fibrillation potentials here. So that this is essence in the findings. Let's look at the nerve roots and superior gluteal nerve, that is L5 root, which causes which supplies the gluteus medius and tensor fasciae. And if you ask the person to abduct the thigh, that is L5 root. And you see the superior gluteal nerve is called root collateral nerve. Root collateral nerve. And because its origin is at the roots, and the superior gluteal nerve and inferior gluteal nerve supplies the gluteus maximus, which also coming from S1 root, and these two are called root collateral nerves. Inferior gluteal nerve, that is the gluteus maximus, and H reflex is seen here. This is studied to identify the S1 root pathology. S1 radiculopathy is the most common thing that happens in the analogy of plexopathies and radiculopathies in the lower limbs. And you stimulate the tibial nerve at the knee, record response over gastrocnemius and soleus. Abnormal H effect indicates pathology in the sensory afferent portion, intraspinal portion, or motor efferent portion of the reflex arc. It does not localize pathology to S1 narrow root, but it only shows that it can have any abnormality. It can pathology can be in afferent sensory, intraspinal portion, or motor efferent portion of the reflex arc. We'll study more about S1 root and subsequent things. So now you please write down all the abnormalities. What is sensory nerve conduction studies showing? What are motor nerve conduction studies are showing? That means distal latency, CMAP, nerve conduction velocity. Then what are the late response of F wave latencies and H reflexes? And if you suspect any entrapment neuropathy, you have to do inching studies to identify. And then you have to confirm then I'll tell you why we should do it into the muscle, and I'll show you the muscle fiber, how the fibers are distributed in this. Why do we do? To identify root and plexus lesions. And when you do nerve conduction studies in upper limb and lower limb, we are only studying CAT1 because you study median nerve and you study ulnar nerve, that is from the inferior trunk, and nothing beyond that. And CAT1 roots and inferior trunk. That's what is you're studying in the upper limb. And lower limb, similarly, you do study what? Common peroneal nerve and posterior tibial nerve, that is L5S1. So other things are not studied there. What we have to do is choose different muscles to determine a root level. That means it should have a same root level, but different now. And I'll give you some examples in the upper limb. This paraspinal muscle involvement is also present or not, you have to study. So, as I said, compressive and entrapment nerve lesions can be studied with EMG. Here, you choose different muscles to determine a nerve involvement. Same nerve, but different root. Because nerves are formed by the mix of roots. So, you should see same nerve with different roots and different muscles to determine a nerve involvement. So, determine whether lesion is affecting the myelin or axon or both. And how will you know? The demyelinating neuropathies have characteristically prolonged distal latencies, prolonged duration, and morphology will be different. And F wave latencies are prolonged. Whereas In axonal thing, the amplitude is lost. So although you have to compare to nerve conduction studies of various nerves to come to a conclusion. Like look at the motor unit anatomy here. The motor axon, you can see it is getting distributed to various places, and you see in a motor unit, the nerve twigs are going to different directions, and branches of motor axon you can see, and these are the myofibrils which are in the motor unit, and this is a muscle fiber, which is this is a muscle fiber. There are many muscle fibers constitute a muscle, and this muscle fiber, this muscle fiber, this muscle fiber, spreading to various different types of muscle fibers in a muscle. That's a very important thing to understand. So what I said earlier, insertional activity, normal spontaneous activity, abnormal spontaneous activity, mild effort, moderate effort, full effort when we do insert the needle. So these are the phases in which we study that MUAP. So what are you looking at? The fibrillation potentials and positive sharp waves when you are looking for abnormal EMG, and muscles with the voluntary contraction, then you see the recruitment and you see the MUAP morphology. So MUAP morphology, again, you study amplitude, you study duration, polyphasic or polyphasia is not. What is amplitude? Is it a small amplitude or large amplitude? A giant action potentials or normal action potentials? Because there is a difference here. Myopathy is characterized by small amplitude MUAPs with complete interference pattern or early recruitment, whereas the neuropathic pattern is characterized by giant action potentials and incomplete interference pattern. So let's look at the insertional activity. It starts as you insert a needle into the muscle. It should stop and become flat line when you stop the insertion. So it starts here and becomes flat. So this like a C, it will not stop unless the needle is removed, and it can be painful too. So pain is felt means you are at the near the end plate. Otherwise, once the skin is pierced and the needle is in the muscle, it should be less painful. Abnormal insertional activity consists of fibrillation potentials, okay, fibs and positive sharp waves seen in early denervation. Typically, they start appearing 3 weeks after the lesion. It's not painful and does not stop if you pull the needle away from it, and it fires regularly. And you can see that that sound is so characteristic, as if raindrops are falling on the roof. You can see now how the motor unit and the motor axon, motor unit, the fibers are dispersed at far and more. So one motor neuron splits and supplies motor fibers which are distributed at random in this muscle. So that dictates the amplitude, duration, and phases. And so that's very important for us to know. You can see this diagram. This diagram I'll show you again. So in one motor unit, the muscle fibers are dispersed at various places. And see, you can see the morphology of motor unit action potential by needle EMG picks up the MUAP. The amplitude is determined 2 to 3 fibers nearer to the needle tip, whereas the duration is due to all muscle fibers belonging to the motor units. And if they are here, duration is prolonged if they are very widespread and they die. And but the amplitude is determined by 2 to 3 fibers which are nearer to the needle. So amplitude, the phase, so the phases that they should cross the baseline, and then only count the phase. So neurogenic, you can see the grouping of fibers here, which will give rise to giant action potentials, and these are that's why you get duration is prolonged, and as well as there will be giant action potentials. Normal MUP is seen after activating the muscle. Typically 1 to 3 phases are there in this. The number of units goes up as effort is increased. That means the recruitment of motor units go. It needs to be observed at mild, moderate, and full voluntary effort, and all the three things which you have to observe. So these are the normal motor units you can see on the needle EMG. In abnormally, it's seen in chronic nerve injury, long duration, and polyphasic. As you can see, the polyphasic and the duration is prolonged, typically 4 to 5 phases. Sounds thundery on screen, and more recent nerve injury shows polyphasia. Old injury shows long duration. So clinical applications, let's briefly touch before I wind up. So the posterior primary ramus, that's the paraspinal muscles, and as I said, the brachial plexus is formed by the anterior primary rami and posterior primary rami. As the nerve comes out from the intervertebral foramina, spinal nerve divides into anterior primary rami and posterior primary rami. The posterior primary ramus supplies the paraspinal muscles, and some root collateral nerves happen. That is the dorsal and one nerve comes to the trunk, that is the suprascapular nerve in the brachial plexus. And I'll be dealing only with the upper limb in this class. Dorsal scapular nerve, which supplies the rhomboids and the levator scapulae. This is a C5 root collateral nerve. You can see that. Once again. The long thoracic nerve also comes serratus anterior muscle supply from the roots. So in brachial plexus, two nerves come from the roots, that is dorsal scapular nerve, which supplies the rhomboids, and the long thoracic nerve, which supplies the serratus anterior muscle. If these are involved, then you can see the pathology clinically is in the roots. And radiculopathy, the plexopathy is distal to the radiculopathy, and plexopathy, if there is involvement of suprascapular nerve, which supplies the supraspinatus and infraspinatus, and of course lateral cord muscles, the medial cord muscles, and these can be studied also, and you can understand the brachial plexus very well if you remember the lateral cord, the roots, trunks, divisions, cards, and the nerves morphology, one after other. You can remember the lateral cord muscles, the medial cord muscles. Medial cord muscles are mostly CAT1, and the posterior cord muscles are radial nerve, and the axillary nerve that comes from the posterior cord, and they supply the C5, C6 myotum muscles. And basically, the posterior cord is triceps, and extensors of the fingers and wrist extensors are supplied. So you should know the distribution of the myotomes in the upper limb. And radiculopathy, we have already mentioned this. I'm not going to repeat this. But one thing to understand is motor neuron undergoes Wallerian degeneration in radiculopathy. So you lose the CMAP amplitude, but the snaps are very well preserved. And you may develop now on EMG, you can see the fibrillation potentials. Okay. How is CMAP amplitude affected in plexopathy and radiculopathy? In what conditions CMAP amplitude is preserved? If you want to answer these two questions, you should know the radiculopathy, plexopathy, monopathy differences, which I have already told you. CMAP amplitudes are usually preserved in radiculopathy. CMAP amplitude, but it never disappears. Most muscles is applied by more than one root. So totally there is no it's never that a CMAP is absent, and collateral sprouting also takes place. In plexopathies and mononeuropathies, there is more of axon loss, and the CMAP amplitude is lost. So, and again, CAT1 radiculopathies may be associated with the reduced median and ulnar CMAP amplitude, because the CAT1 roots the inferior trunk, and median nerve has a complex anatomy. The median nerve gets its motor supply from CAT1, mostly T1, but the sensory things will go to C5 or C6. So there is some we'll in the coming classes we'll learn about that. The paraspinal muscles and muscles supplied by the root collector nerves may be abnormal in EMG and radiculopathies. So that we have been emphasizing. These are for the beginners, but not for the seniors. Seniors already know all this. In plexopathy, both SNAPs and CMAPs are abnormal because it's a distal to dorsal root ganglion problem. And importance of cutaneous sensation, why we should assess cutaneously. Because if medial antebrachial cutaneous nerve supplies a medial forearm, if this is involved, it is no more a median the ulnar nerve problem. Entrapment neuropathies may coexist with cervical radiculopathies. The sensory cutaneous nerves are never compressed. So involvement of sensory potential suggests brachial plexopathy than neuropathy. So primary plexopathies and primary posterior rami are normal, and root collateral nerves are normal, but SNAPs are abnormal. And EMG is abnormal in more than one nerve territory. Paraspinal muscles and muscles supplied by the root gland nerves are normal on EMG. That is a characteristic of plexopathy. So if you want to plan for EMG of upper nerve extremity, you say first dorsal interosseous, which is supplied by ulnar nerve and C8T1 roots. Abductor pollicis brevis is supplied by median nerve, but it also has C8T1. So same root, but different nerves. Flexor carpi radialis, which is C6, C7 root, it's a median nerve supply. And C6, 7 triceps also is there, which is radial nerve. That is same root, different nerve. That is median and radial. We look at the brachioradialis, radial nerve C5, C6, brachioradialis, and deltoid axillary C5, C6 roots. So again, you have the C5, C6 involvement of same root but different nerves, and cervical paraspinals C5, T1. So you should look for same root, different nerve things, and same root and different nerves. First dorsal interosseous, the C8T1, and abductor pollicis brevis, that is C8T1 median nerve. So ulnar and median. So these are the two important muscles we do EMG in the upper limb. And median nerve C6, C7, flexor carpi radialis, and triceps C6, C7, same root but different nerve, that is radial nerve. We do the EMG of triceps. And flexor carpi radialis, same root value but different nerves. Different root value but same nerve. You see, abductor pollicis brevis, the median nerve C8T1, and flexor carpi radialis also applied with median nerve. It's got a C6, C7. So you got a different root value, but same nerve in the upper extremity. So these are the nuances which, these are important things which you should remember. Same root value, different nerves. Again, you see radial C5, C6, brachioradialis, and deltoid axillary, that is C5, C6. So we have given you 3 examples of different nerves and same root, and 1 example of same root and different nerves. So I think the cervical paraspinals are important in establishing the radiculopathy. So that's all for today in the introduction to electrophysiology. We'll take classes frequently in next couple of months on electrophysiology. We'll deal with the electromyography initially, then we may go on to the EEG studies and night times. Any questions or anything which you want to ask? Anybody wants to answer? Anyone want to ask any question? Or if I ask some questions, will you answer? Are you all there? You can unmute. You can unmute and ask. Shall I unmute all of you? Okay. So if you think that there are no questions, we'll meet next week. Yes, there is one question in chat box. Okay. Right then, if there are no questions, we'll have more discussions in the coming classes. And I wish you all the best. Thank you very much. Good night.